Welcome to the second episode of POLITalks at TAMUSA. This is the Political Science Programs podcast, and I'm happy to welcome a guest from outside our department. As I explained before, as we talked before in the previous episode, we will alternate our guests. There will be people from our program, from the university, and people from outside our program. But in general, we will be pursuing the same goals, so to speak. We will try to understand more and to help the viewers and the listeners understand more about political science, this weird and wonderful field of study. We'll talk about some current political events, and we're going to get to know these wonderful people who get to pursue a career in political science. So my guest today, I'm very honored and happy to have as my guest today Dr. Sheahan from Duquesne University, and he just published relatively recently, a very interesting book that we will talk about today. So very welcome, Luke, to our podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
And we're going to address each other on a first-name basis. We actually happen to know ourselves outside of the podcast situation as well. So just to start, tell us a little bit about yourself, right? I always want to see how do people stumble into this field of political science. So tell us a little bit about your background, where are you from, and so on.
So I grew up in the state of Oregon, and so the Pacific Northwest. I was an undergraduate at Oregon State University, where I majored in political science. And so I got interested in political matters from reading the news and opinion journalism, but especially I got interested in the background. So what is it about political order that makes it worthwhile and humane? What is it about statesmanship that makes our political leaders better or worse, especially in our democratic context? So some of those kind of started thinking about some of those larger political questions that underlie much of our day-to-day politics. So as an undergraduate, I got interested in that, majored in political science. When I graduated in 2006, I worked for a nonprofit for 4 years, doing civil liberties sort of issues, and it got me really interested in the constitutional rights that Americans are very proud of, our Bill of Rights. We talk a lot about it. In fact, I often explain to my students that Americans tend to frame everything, including duties and responsibilities, in terms of rights. That's just kind of the lingo that we're used to. And so I got interested in kind of similar deep questions. Where do rights come from? How do they wind up in our Constitution? What do they mean? How important are they? How do they facilitate our political life? And how do they facilitate our social life as well, outside of politics? So I got interested in those, decided to enroll in a PhD program at the Catholic University of America, finished my PhD there, spent a couple of years as a postdoc at Duke University, and then spent 1 year as a postdoc at Wellesley College up outside of Boston, and then I landed my current position as a tenure-track assistant professor here at Duquesne University.
Wonderful. You covered a lot of ground, but I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I think there's plenty to address there. So where exactly in Oregon did you grow up?
So I grew up in Lebanon, which is a small town about an hour and a half south of Portland.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that growing up there has shaped your view of society, of community, right, of associations, of politics?
Oh, sure, yeah. You're ineradicably shaped by your upbringing. So I think growing up at a small town, you do think about a lot of the interactions you have are explicitly non-political. So it's about relationships in your school, your friendships, business partnerships. So you see, like many places, some listeners might have grown up, business partnerships were also family partnerships. There was a lot of that going around. So people would go into business together, and they would also be second cousins, on the mother's side, third cousins on the father's side. These sorts of kind of hobbit-like relationships that you'd see, kind of shaped. Well, our relationships are very complicated. It's not just democratic citizenship. There's all these other relationships, and how do those relate? And what role do those play in our lives, and how can they be sheltered or shaped in salutary ways? Mm-hmm.
So was your extended family also around there, or do you have them in other places in the United States or abroad?
Yeah, so my extended family was not around there. So it was just my immediate family there. Saw a lot of my friends in those extended relationships, but my extended family ends up being quite scattered throughout the kind of Pacific, well, really the whole western United States. So Colorado, Montana, Utah, California, lots of different places.
A very American way of growing up, right? With a nuclear family. Because again, we're touching on things that you implicitly or explicitly address in the book. And I think that all of this has influenced your outlook, and obviously as you have confirmed. Another interesting aspect is that growing up in Oregon, and I know you love Oregon and what's not to love, and the Pacific Northwest, but then you spent most of your life after that on the East Coast, right? So basically Pennsylvania, DC, Boston, and you seem to have found a new home there. How do you compare these two experiences?
Yeah, so in some ways they're very, very different. So there's some cultural differences, especially when you move from a small town. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, and even Oregon State is frankly, a pretty small town. It wasn't actually that different from the town I grew up in, frankly. A little bit bigger, and there's College Town, of course, brings some new dynamics, but not that different. And then you move to Philadelphia and DC and Boston. These are very different places in terms of culture. So that's gave some good experiences in terms of seeing different ways of living, different ways of being, and how people are shaped by that. Now, as it turns out, Duquesne is in Pittsburgh, and I actually live outside of Pittsburgh. So I'm again in a small town with a lot of farmers around. It's kind of a very similar dynamics to actually what I grew up in. So it's in terms of where my house is and where my children are being raised and that sort of thing.
Yeah, but can we say, or would you say that you have found a comfortable, environment, area, region, culturally, socially in Pennsylvania?
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, Pennsylvania's it's a great state. It's got a lot of it's got Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, so it's got the big cities. Then it's got this kind of great heartland feel in between those two big cities. So we got great kind of sports programs at the two sides of the state, and then a lot of other things going on. So it's within a few hours you get a lot of different cultural experiences. So we can take the kids to the zoo and to the Pirates game, and then we can go and visit our friend's farm, and they get to see cows and stuff. We get it all within 48 hours.
That's true. I very much enjoy Pennsylvania, especially at that area where it meets with West Virginia and Ohio. It's a beautiful area. So I noticed that you did your BA at the Honors College?
Yeah, that's right.
So how did you end up at the Honors College? Because that also says something. I mean, did you choose to go to the Honors College? Was a professor who led you there?
Yeah, so I chose to apply there when I applied to Oregon State. Seemed like a good opportunity to, at the time, being, as many high school seniors are, driven and trying to get the kind of stripes on your sleeve. I thought that would look good. It turned out to be a great experience. So, we had our kind of own study area, and so you got, it was hard to get a computer in the computer lab, but if you went to the Honors College computer lab, there was always one open, except for maybe that week before finals when it might be a little tough. But otherwise, you always got a computer. It was always quiet. They had a special dean and administrative staff who were just dedicated to the Honors College, so you always got kind of your hand held and everything that you needed through the process. So it ended up being a great experience for me.
Well, that in terms of, obviously the attention, the small classes and all that. What did it give you in terms of a more holistic sort of course of study, right? Because I assume, I don't know, because each honors program is different, right? So did this honors program allow you to pursue other areas of knowledge, sort of to have a more interdisciplinary course of learning?
Yeah, so that's what's interesting about it is the Honors College was just everyone. It was everyone who qualified in terms of GPA and the essays they wrote and SAT scores. So it was just a cross section of the university, kind of at the top level. These were the kind of the achieving students, and there you were thrust into an honors course together. So it gave you a really kind of broad education just at its basis. This was not going to be, a distribution requirement where you get a cross section, but maybe not in a great way. You're just all fulfilling some course requirements. You're all there, you elected into that program, but it's a cross section. So you had this kind of broad base. People headed to medical school, people had to PhD programs, people had to law school, all in one place, you know, so.
Yeah, and I have worked in honors programs and have always sort of gravitated in that direction besides my work in political science, because it gives that sort of, it's inherently interdisciplinary, it gives that sort of a holistic and maybe we could say humanistic sort of approach that is, for example, my approach to political science, but I would say also yours, perhaps we could say that. And that takes us to you know, your recent book, Why Associations Matter, and you know, in this podcast we're trying to tackle some, you know, current, or let's say concrete political issues, and your book does that. And although your book is a very much a scholarly book, we also try to sort of translate it from English to English, so to speak, right, to appeal to the broader audience. So if I were to, you know, as a let's say I'm a lay person, and I were to ask you, what is your book about? I'm Uncle Bob at the Thanksgiving dinner. So look, my grandsons, or, you know, my nephew, what is this book about?
So my book is titled Why Associations Matter, and it's about freedom of association. So one half of it is criticizing the Supreme Court's treatment of freedom of association in its case law, which I don't think has adequately protected or understood what freedom of association is. The freedom to form associations with our fellow human beings in this country. And I try to offer a solution. How can we better understand what associations are, why they matter, and then figure out in our constitutional law, so in Supreme Court case law or federal case law, how we can articulate it in such a way that they can be better protected than what the Supreme Court has given us.
Mm-hmm. So this goes to the First Amendment, right? So in the First Amendment, there are 5 rights that are protected famously, right? Speech, of the right of the press, freedom of religion, of course, freedom of petition, and freedom of association. So this is all in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Obviously, the framers and you know, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in their debates thought that these were important things to protect. Obviously, it starts with religion, and then, you know, speech, press, association, and petition. So how did you stumble upon this specific thing? Now, in your background, you seem to your areas of interest seem to cover both political philosophy in general, American political thought, and constitutional law. So was it by taking courses in both these fields that you sort of stumbled upon, oh, wait a minute, this thing from here applies here? Or what was the process of stumbling upon this stuff?
Yeah, so there's the Supreme Court case in 2010, Christian Legal Society versus Martinez. In that case, the Supreme Court rules against the group. And it surprised a lot of court watchers. Given this previous kind of trajectory of the Supreme Court's case law, it seems like the court was going to be very protective, tends to be very protective when civil liberties come up and civil rights come up. And it wasn't in this case. And it rules against this organization, and it seemed to, I can go into more details on the case in a moment, but that's what caught me off guard, is what went wrong here? How did this happen at the Supreme Court level, not the lower courts? How did this happen? And so, you know, that was 2010. I was just starting grad school at that time, and it was kind of in the back of my mind. And so I kept an interest in reading Supreme Court case law and kind of keeping up with it. And I had an opportunity during grad school to take a course in constitutional law. And I was rereading that case, and at the same time, I was doing political theory, and I read Robert Nisbet's The Quest for Community, this great book from 1953. It's kind of considered a classic in American political sociology. And he makes this kind of very broad argument there that the trajectory of the modern state over the last 500 years, as it's kind of grown under the Tudor monarchs in England, the centralization of political power under the Tudor monarchs, and then kind of morphing into what we understand to be the modern nation state. He said this trajectory has sapped all of the plethora of social institutions that had previously existed and governed people's lives in a very pluralistic and complicated way. The central state took power from all of these different associations, kind of absorbed their functions, absorbed their authority. So it became the kind of undenying supreme authority, which was the intent of those early modern kings. And they had various arguments on why they were the central political figure and central religious figure, for that matter. So it kind of sapped it. So I was reading this. He makes this very broad argument, and he argues it continues up into the 20th century in the modern democracies. So I was reading it, very interesting arguments, and then I kind of realized I think what he's talking about in this kind of broad, sweeping, account under political sociology is actually happening in this microcosm in Supreme Court case law. And so the trajectory of Supreme Court case law in the 20th century was doing exactly what he predicts in 1953 and describes, but it's doing it in this kind of very small way regarding freedom of association and Supreme Court case law. So it ended up being this really interesting study of, in the last 60 years, do we see Nisbet's thesis playing out in American constitutional law? I argue that that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing kind of this idea of the state with a capital S, vindicating the individual with a capital I at the expense of these smaller groups. And sometimes, in history, that's, as Nisbet points out, that can be a very humane development. Sometimes it can be inhumane. It can't be all of a piece. So I kind of take that framework, criticize the Supreme Court's treatment of this, and argue that we need to develop an idea of the association apart from the individual and apart from the political state as its own thing, and that you might say the First Amendment compels us, the Assembly Clause in the First Amendment compels us to come up with an account of that textual right.
So, I mean, obviously Nisbet is not the only one who has written about this, and you have used him as, a tool because he gave you some theoretical framework, some tools, but, we can find the same argument made in the literature by many authors, which I think we can say that it boils down to the fact that the modern state, basically which was the creator of liberalism, but it freed the individual, right? It released the individual by eliminating groups, intermediate groups and intermediate layers. What, for example, in the French Revolution happened in one fell swoop, right? They literally and physically removed the intermediate strata of associations and of various legal conditions, right? Because they had different legal, different groups had different legal conditions and different rights and different obligations. And there wasn't like a mass of population, all of them made equal by an equal relation to the state. And only a modern state that is very powerful can erase all of that all those intermediate layers and create a straight up relationship between the state and the individual in which they're all leveled to legal equality by this powerful, Leviathan, right? So that's been an argument, obviously, in other literature as well. So if this is the argument, clearly there is a conflict here between this, over powerful Leviathan, the modern state, and this individual, the naked individual, so to speak, right, who is no longer protected by all kinds of associations and groups, and the very fact that there is the right to association in the First Amendment. So my question to you is what has been the development? Because you said this change has manifested itself in the development of Supreme Court case law, basically, right? In their decisions over time. So what was the change, and how do they deal now with the right of association since it's there, right? So what was the nature of this change, and how do they approach the right to association today?
Yeah, so let's go all the way back. We have this right to peaceable assembly in the First Amendment. Now, what's interesting is in the debates in the first Congress, when they're proposing the Bill of Rights, they almost struck that from the record. And the reason they were going to strike it is not because they didn't want it to be there, but because they thought it was so obvious. It was Sedgwick, Congressman Sedgwick from Massachusetts, who said, we need to take this out because it's so obvious it is demeaning to the dignity of the House to descend to such minutia. That's his quote. Because he thought, well, it's obvious if you have freedom of religion, obviously people are assembling to worship. If you have freedom of speech, people are assembling to speak. If you have freedom of the press, people are assembling to publish. So it's very clear that this right is absolutely required in order for us to have any of these other rights. So let's take it out. Now, John Page of Virginia says it is obvious that this right should exist. In fact, it's so obvious is the right of a man to wear his hat when he leaves. It's a very important historical reference that he makes there, which is completely obscure to us today. At the time, it would have been very important. So this is a reference to William Penn, who in 1670 had been arrested for unlawful assembly, because in England at that time, there was the Conventicle Act of 1664, which forbade the meeting of more than, I think, 5 people for religious worship that was not Anglican. And so William Penn, being a Quaker, gathered with his fellow Quakers. There were more than 5 of them. He was arrested and taken to court, and he refuses to remove his hat. and he was held in contempt for that. So he was refusing to recognize the authority of the court over him. So that statement from John Page wins the day, and the Assembly Clause stays in. So this is important because it meant that they were thinking when they were drafting this about peaceable assemblies that weren't political assemblies. They weren't thinking in terms of political parties, although that would cover it. They weren't thinking in terms of constitutional conventions, and very famous political scientists like Keel Amar at Yale Law School argues that the Assembly Clause is about protecting a future constitutional convention. It would extend to that, but what they had in mind was the relationships, the plethora of relationships that exist out there in civil society. That's what we would call it today, our civil society relationships, and a plethora of complicated groups that exist all around us. That's what they were thinking of, the protection for those, and that's the explicit reference they make, are to these just assemblies, or as we would call them today, associations. So we see that in the debates. They keep it in the text, and then when we get into the 20th century and the Supreme Court starts applying, via the 14th Amendment, the First Amendment rights against the state, it applies all of them, and it applies the Assembly Clause in 1937. Now, however, unlike with the Speech Clause and the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause and the Press Clause, the court takes a bunch of cases and it starts kind of unpacking them. So what is it that free speech means? And it goes through a bunch of different things, what free speech means and what it doesn't mean, what its exceptions are. With the Assembly Clause, though, it doesn't do that. It incorporates it in 1937. It has another famous case in 1945, and then it just drops it. Now, this is very curious because in the 1950s, the NAACP is very active, and the Supreme Court they face a lot of pushback during the Civil Rights era, and the Supreme Court takes their cases and it rules on behalf of the NAACP, which is the right decision from the perspective of freedom of association and civil rights. So far, so good. However, it doesn't make reference to the Assembly Clause. Now, part of this is the court's kind of internal dynamics. For example, Justice Frankfurter absolutely would not sign on to the opinion if the rest of the court put in the First Amendment. He insisted it was just the 14th Amendment. It was this, he was a stick in the mud and he just wouldn't sign on. And the court wanted these to be 9-0 opinions. They kind of be unquestioned by the country when they came down. So starting in 1958, the court rules 5 times in 5 years on behalf of the NAACP. However, first 3 cases, it only references the 14th Amendment, despite the fact you can tell the majority really wanted to reference the First Amendment. So it says things like freedom of association is very important, just like speech and press. It's clearly listing those other rights and it wants to list it, but it doesn't do so. And then finally in 1961, it does reference the First Amendment in the majority opinion. However, it's a little ambiguous. So where exactly is this freedom of association? It doesn't say it's in the Assembly Clause. It kind of says, well, it's just there. It's implied in the First Amendment. You can't do any of those other things without freedom of association, which is true, I would argue. But it doesn't give it a good textual location. And it defends it in terms of the importance of democracy.
So just to clarify here, because I think it's an important point that you're making in now and also in the book, is that they tie the freedom of association, or the right to association basically, to the other freedoms from the First Amendment. Which you said it's self-understood, and other authors have said that as well, that you cannot worship alone, right? That's a communal thing, and on and on, and the freedom of speech requires that you're able to speak in common and so on. So basically they sort of subsume it to the other freedoms. What was the reason?
Yeah, so the court didn't give us a straight up reason, but it talks in terms of the importance of democratic change and democratic dialogue. So we're a democracy. We are undergoing some major changes in the 1950s. We have to be able to talk about it, airing grievances. The court uses this sort of language. So that is, it uses speech language. It's important to talk. In assembly or association is really important to conveying views. To bring about that change.
So the freedom of assembly, so the freedom of assembly becomes sort of subsumed to a broader view that sees all those freedoms as part of basically the rights of a citizen to be active politically. So they're all understood. They're all understood under a political, sort of through a political veil or sort of prism, and everything, and they all serve for you to be part of the sort of the marketplace of ideas and active politically and be an active active citizens. So that's kind of their broader overview.
That's right. Yeah, so it sees them kind of purely in terms of what you're going to do politically as a citizen to bring about change. Often, we as citizens work through associations. They're a very effective means. All of that is true as far as it goes.
And they understand politics very narrowly.
Very narrowly, that's right. So we're talking about getting change through our legislatures or through our voting, which is a very, as you said, narrow understanding of what politics is. And so it leaves out a whole bunch of associations which are not expressive and don't engage in those sorts of political changes. Then as the court's case law plays out, after those initial cases, the court starts using the term expressive association to describe the right of association. So narrowly, it's when you're expressing views to bring about political change.
That's even more explicit that they're narrowing down the understanding of association, indeed, yeah.
That's right. So it becomes a very narrow right, and so you see, this is the Supreme Court's articulation of this right, and you see the lower courts, of course, follow suit, as they're required to do. So it means at those lower court levels, they're ruling against, say, fraternities and sororities, for example. They're not expressive. They're just fraternal. They're just about the relationships. They're not expressive. So there's all sorts of clubs that the courts, including the lower courts, start ruling against. They say, well, you're not expressive. Why should you have an associational right? And so, maybe some of these places or these associations would be exceptions to the right of association for some reason. If the court had done an associational analysis, it could have given us some contours. But instead, it latches on to this very narrow understanding of expressive association, which means it excludes a vast swath of non-expressive groups that are very important to the shaping of our character and our thinking. So I mentioned, fraternal groups are very important to that. There's an interesting book that just was published by Anthony Bradley called Heroic Fraternities, and he's making this argument that we hear all this kind of talk about, the kind of free fall that men and boys are in. And he said, well, fraternities, virtuous fraternities might be salvific for a lot of young men who are going after, following nasty characters on YouTube. Well, we have these institutions that could shape them in a much better direction. Unfortunately, those groups do not have freedom of association. The courts have said that repeatedly. And it's going to be a necessary element in encouraging these sorts of associations to exist. And that's just one example of what they could be. So the court's ignorance of this then leads us up to 2010 in Christian Legal Society versus Martinez, where the court rules against this small Christian group. It had about 9 people in it at a public university, Hastings Law School in California. So what the court says there is, well, there's this Christian group which required its members to be Christian. You had to take a statement of faith to join the group. Yeah. Fairly standard procedure.
Well, yeah, it's called the Christian group because it's Christian, probably. Yeah.
Yes. So it's fairly standard. If you're going to join the College of Republicans or College Democrats, you're generally expected to adhere to that party platform. If you're going to join the basketball group, you're going to play basketball and like basketball. I mean, surprisingly.
Yeah, shocking.
Fairly standard stuff.
Shocking, yeah.
And the university turns down their constitution on those grounds. And it seems like an open and shut case. Obviously, Christian Legal Society can expect its members to be Christian. That should be obvious. And instead, the court said, well, no, the individuals in this group can express whatever views they want regarding Christianity. There's no reason they should be able to turn away students at Hastings Law School who don't agree with their views and want to join the group. In fact, it would be even better for expression because they'll be able to have different views and they'll be able to debate. The problem with that is, what about the association? What about the purposes of that group that are not actually about expression? They're about that group coming together around their shared evangelical faith. And what about that aspect of it? What about the basketball club who doesn't want the golf players to join because it wants to play basketball?
Well, it goes even further. I mean, there's some blatant examples. The Society for Saving, the dolphins, or the seals, baby seals, and I'm a baby seal hunter, and that's my. I don't think they're going to accept me for some reason, or like me. So because there's sort of a common sense. Understanding here, but how did they reach this understanding? Yeah, so that's what you're digging into, right?
Right. So the court makes a series of arguments, and it basically says, we're not even going to consider the expressive association arguments because really that's just about free speech. And so as I said, the speech rights of the individuals in the group are not censored or blocked. They can express whatever is on their minds, whatever they believe regarding Christianity or anything else. So no speech rights problem. And again, no associational analysis. What about the group that's operating at this public university? And then kind of the other side of it, so that's the individual side, seeing very much just individual capital I, and the expressive rights of the individual is the only thing at issue. And the other side is, I call it the democratic state, because they said, well, Hastings Law School is a public law school, is an extension of the democratic state, and they can encourage debate and discussion among citizens and among students. So it's okay to intrude into this group's associational prerogatives if they can encourage that sort of discussion, which is important for democracy, of course. So they don't, again, so their two concerns are, an individual can express him or herself, and the state, the democratic state, needs citizens to talk to each other. Those are the only two concerns they would consider.
But it's only the state and the individual who are basically players in this equation.
That's right, which is exactly the dynamic that Robert Nisbet had talked about in his famous book from 1953, is playing out, and it's suppressing all these different groups. And here we saw it in this microcosm of the Supreme Court. That's its framework. It's the only framework that it has. So do we have a right of association insofar as it advances speech rights, very narrowly construed, and the prerogatives of the democratic state.
Yeah, because it goes even
narrowly construed.
It goes even beyond expressive association, because one could make the argument that this association, I don't know, Christian, Islamic, seal, saving the seals, whatever, them as a group are supposed to express one view, and another group called, baby seal hunters express the other group, and they're different groups because they represent different views, and the members will subscribe to different views. And that's expressive association, that's the idea of the marketplace, but they seem through this decision to bypass the whole, even the idea of expressive association itself, because they only go to the individual versus the state. The association doesn't, loses even this function of being a machine or a means of transporting or coalescing those views. So it's really the naked relationship between the state and the individual in this understanding, it seems to me.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, so you see the kind of trajectory of the case law is kind of further individualizing the right of association, and it kind of reaches its reductio ad absurdum in CLS versus Martinez. It's I think it was kind of disastrous from that perspective, and it's still live in the case law now. The good news is the court almost never refers to it. So in the where we are in 14 years since then, the court just doesn't refer to it. I mean, there's been some theories that, there's a 5-4 opinion. Had Justice Kagan, for example, been on the court instead of Justice Ginsburg, she almost certainly would have gone the other way on it. So, it ends up as curious in the case law. My concerns are it's still live, it's still there. So a future court can mine it, and the ramifications are very broad. The court would have to choose to leave it narrow.
Yeah.
Right?
What was the decision? How did they split on the decision?
It was a 5-4.
Oh, well, very narrow, clearly. Yeah.
So, that's the good news there. Bad news is just as authoritative as 9-0.
Yeah, of course.
In terms of
but symbolically, and as we know, things can be, minority opinions can also be interpreted, right? And have. So this is your critique, right? So your critique uses Nisbet to show that what he has predicted, what he has analyzed as basically a phenomenon happening in modern society, by which I mean modernity, society under modernity, or rather the modern state. This is actually playing out right here, right now, as we speak, in the United States, and it is shown in their interpretation of the basic rights and liberties, freedoms of the U.S. citizens, and their interpretation follows that narrow sort of narrowing and continuously narrowing philosophy of eliminating all the intermediate strata between the individual and the state. So what is this is your critique? What are you trying to bring then? What is your solution? What did you propose in your book? What was your out of this problem?
Yeah, so I suggest that the court needs to under the Assembly Clause, which it's ignored, it needs to develop an idea of the association, the assembly. What exactly is this third thing that is protected in the Assembly Clause under freedom of association? That's what we would call it today. So when you hear assembly and you read it in the text, think association. That's what they had in mind, the founders. So what exactly would that be? So how could we develop a judicial test, for example, to know what that is? So using Robert Nisbet again, who had spent his entire career thinking about associations as such and how they might be protected, he has this term he calls functional autonomy. So it says, what can we do in terms of public policy, or I'm thinking in terms of constitutional law, what can we do to protect these? And I think a term we could use is functional autonomy. So what that means is, how can we protect the autonomy of a group regarding its function? Christian Legal Society versus Martinez. What was its point? Its point was to bring together Christian law students around their faith and their vocation and mentor them in that direction. What sort of autonomy does that group need to be able to accomplish that function? It needs to be able to choose its voting members and its leaders on the basis of being law students at Hastings, so vocation and vocational aspirations and faith. That's what it needs. Our constitutional law ought to give them that birth, that leeway. So the court could ask the question, does this policy, whatever it is, does it inhibit the functional autonomy of the group? That's the first question. Now, there might be exceptions to that for all sorts of reasons, but that's going to be the first question. The answer is a yes to that, you get really worried. Second question might be something like this. Does the policy inhibit or infringe upon the prescribed and implied practices of the group? So this is another discussion that Nisbet has that's related. He talks about the importance of tradition. Now think in your mind, by tradition, think lowercase t and plural, traditions. Just ways of being, things a group does that are peculiar to it. So a lot of times outside of groups, some of the practices of a group seems opaque. So think of various religious traditions. If you're not a part of them, it can seem confusing why something is important.
Think of comic book groups. Think of, nerd groups, right? I mean, they can be pretty opaque as well, the Marvel universe and all of that, and that's the charm of it, right?
Right. To think about, why would a particular group, religious group, say, want to have a meeting at 3 o'clock on Friday? It's like, well, you can meet on Thursday. You can meet on 4 o'clock. Why 3 o'clock on Friday? Well, for particular groups, like Christian groups, 3 o'clock on Friday is really important.
Or for Islam, is obviously their Sabbath is the Friday and so on. Yeah.
Right. And so when a group says we need to meet on Friday, not Thursday, and it's the Muslim Student Association, there's a reason for that. If you're outside that tradition, it might be, well, who cares? Well, for them it matters. Or you think in some religious traditions, like mine, beards can be aesthetically desirable, but they're not theologically required. But for some groups, they're really important. From outside, I don't get it. I don't get why you have to have one. But that doesn't matter. That I don't get it. What matters is they get it. So you want to be as deferent as you can to the group. Might be very good reasons that are important to the internal cohesion of the group and the communication of its values among the group members, that something is important. This practice, this tradition is really important. So you want to, as much as possible, not infringe upon those. So those are kind of the two major questions. The functional autonomy of the group, can it perform its function? And then these other prescribed practices or implied practices that the group seems to latch onto, but from outside seem unimportant. As much as possible, you want to not intrude. You don't know what you might be interrupting if you say, no, sorry, Fridays are off limits to you Muslims and Christians. I don't know why you're so fixated on it, but no, you don't get those days. From outside, it might seem unimportant. From inside, it might mean everything.
It's existentially important, yeah.
Right.
But so this would be the test that you proposed, basically designed for Supreme Court decisions or for court decisions, right? To see whether or not this decision will infringe on that right to association. Would be the test.
That's right.
Uh-huh. Now, here's my question. Why should we, it's in the First Amendment, but why should we actually care about it beyond that? Of course, that's important enough, so I don't want to diminish that because it's about the First Amendment and perhaps the understanding of association of the framers, which is a different discussion. But in your opinion, or coming from a more holistic view, why is the right to association or the freedom to association, why are associations important for the human being? Why should we care?
So human beings are, as we know from Aristotle, fundamentally social beings.
Well, and here's where there seems to be a conflict of understandings already, right? So I think so. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So we're fundamentally social beings. We have these plethora of relationships, and it's human beings seem to need those. We are kind of fundamentally communal. And so we have all these relationships around us. So the problem is that a particular understanding of political thought that we might get from, say, Thomas Hobbes or Jean-Jacques Rousseau tends to obscure those or sees them only in terms of their downsides, which they can have downsides. But it doesn't see all the upsides, that it kind of shapes our personality. So one kind of important historical fact is, the most active people in these civil society institutions that I talk about will be, historically, the ones who are in the broader political society alienated. So Robert Putnam talks about that in the early 1900s, the most active group in the civil society institutions are black men. And it's the height of the Jim Crow era, when legally and politically things are not good in terms of civil rights. The most active groups in all these civil society associations are the ones who are most persecuted in that legal order. And of course, the NAACP is another example of this. That's where the touchstone really comes down in the Supreme Court. So when we talk about these civil society institutions and the relationships, the importance of kind of building and securing an individual. So this actually goes all the way back to Alexis de Tocqueville, who recognized that it was in these associations in a democracy that human beings can actually act, not just expressively and democratically, but do things. Build a road, In England, there's an aristocrat, and he can, via his peasants, he can do anything. He can build a road, he can put a roof on the church, he can do all sorts of things. America doesn't have aristocrats who can just order people around and have these institutions under them. They have to just voluntarily do it. And he says, fortunately, Americans do that. They join together and they start a school. They join together and they start a seminary. They join together and fix the road. They do all these things, and they have to just have this broad freedom to do it. Or else they'll lose the art, the practice of it. And then they won't know how to do anything. And then you're in a bad way if they forget this, how to actually associate and accomplish this.
But, and arguably, one could argue that this need of association, need of sociality, this inherent sociality of the human being, right? Because that's what we talk about when we talk about the man is, that the human being is a social animal. That's what Aristotle talks about, is that it's inherently social. It goes beyond being able to do something or even being something in the sense of, achieving things. One could argue that just becoming a human being, being a human being as such, is impossible without society, is impossible without association. You will not become a human being on your own. I always give the example of, feral children who were found, in the jungle. Every 10 years there's a story in the newspapers about that. And it's always the same, that if you don't have that human interaction at the right time in your development, as developmental psychology has shown, Piaget and others, then you never acquire those things. You have the potential, but you never acquire and develop those things that make you fully human being. So actually you cannot become a human being and be a human being on your own. At a certain point when you are autonomous, you can leave and whatever, but back to Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, right? The place for the fullness of the human being was in the city. It was the gods, right, who could live outside of the city, and there's some intuition there for that, but which was confirmed by developmental psychology. So my point is that, because this is where I'm kind of aiming, that it seems that there's an argument. Of course, the argument you need to make is legal because we're working within the constitutional law of the United States. But there is a deeper, problem and argument which has to do with what is it to be a human being, and in fact, if you look at the partisan politics in the United States, both sides tend to sort of err in the individualist side on certain issues and not on the others, both sides, and also criticize the other side for not being communitarian enough. But both of them sort of seem to be stuck in this sort of paradigm. Fortunately, this podcast and me myself are agnostic in terms of party politics, so we don't take sides. But this is why we can talk about this. So my point is, do you think this, because your book is wonderfully focused, and you give specific solutions, and you describe one of them, which is the test, and there's another one that you propose, which we'll talk about in a second. But do you think that this is also taps into the deeper sort of debate that is going on now about the crisis of liberalism and about where is liberalism heading?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, there's been kind of a big, a lot of talk recently on the decline of liberalism or the collapse of liberalism. What comes after liberalism? That's a common refrain we hear in the title of a famous book by Patrick Deneen, After Liberalism. So it does tie into it. So a lot of those, they call themselves post-liberals. They're trying to plan for what comes afterwards. They sometimes will use Nisbet's critique. They'll say, well, this is liberalism is kind of headed for this inevitable demise because of the way it frames the individual and the state. It's not sustainable. It takes generations, but eventually it kind of collapses in on itself, and you're going to be stuck with an authoritarian government of some sort. And so it relates to that in the sense that I'm not convinced that the trajectory is as fixed as they think it is, given associations. If we have associations, so if we fix this part, of course it's not just fixing it in the case law, that's part of it, that's what I'm focused on, but fix it in our society, well, there's no reason you can't have a liberal society as long as those broad, association of protections and activity is there. As you said, this is kind of touching on what it means to be human. Much of what we recognize as fundamentally human, you're born with that potential, but has to be developed in associations. And it's, the psychological and sociological literature on it, I'd say, is, as close as we get in the social sciences to being definitive.
And my question wasn't necessarily about the critique of liberalism and their various arguments from various schools that talk about that, but the fact that there is a crisis, there are some conflicts that emerge from the liberal paradigm, and this seems to be one of those conflicts. This seems to be one of those problems that clearly emerges from the liberal paradigm of the over-powerful state and the individual, the freedom of the individual, and only these two things really mattering in the liberal paradigm. And that forgets the social dimension. And let's not forget, socialist parties were formed as a response to this, and and against this, just as much as the conservative answer, in the traditional conservative answer, right, in the 19th century, was a communitarian sort of response, right? Wasn't this liberal free market response? It was the opposite of that, actually, because obviously free market economy is a liberal paradigm, again. And so you had in your book, you make this test, you build this test. I think you also point towards some specific policy solutions. Would you want to touch on that?
Yes, sure. So I suggest that an enterprising federal judge or justice could use this test to be a helpful way of articulating what should be protected in the Assembly Clause in terms of associations. Our legislatures, though, could also do this. So in the 1990s, when there was early 1990s, the Supreme Court passed down Employment Division versus Smith, and it basically, again, 5-4, gave a very weak protection for freedom, for the free exercise clause, free exercise of religion. It did not require exemptions for important religious practices. So the specifics of that case had to do with members of the Native American Church imbibing peyote, which was an important kind of sacramental drug, so for their religion. Now there was a kind of a big outcry, bipartisan, if you can believe it, in those days that was possible, and we passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act almost unanimously in both houses of Congress. So just overwhelming support. Bill Clinton didn't have to sign it because it was veto-proof, but he signs it, so all the institutions are on board. And basically what the legislation said is the courts have to heighten their scrutiny. So they have to use the strictest standards when engaging in free exercise analysis. So the free exercise clause, your religious practice is at issue, the courts need to heighten their analysis. The Supreme Court later says that doesn't extend to states and localities, and a whole bunch of states, a couple dozen states, pass their own versions. So they're going to protect free exercise at the highest level in their state. So I suggest we could have a Freedom of Association Protection Act and do the exact same thing. Congress could pass it and require at the federal level protections for freedom of association, and basically require the courts to use this functional autonomy test and to heighten scrutiny. When you're dealing with associations, you have to heighten your scrutiny, and you have to provide them with this protection. And then states could do the same thing at their state and local level. So that's my policy solution.
Yeah. And your policy solution, and I think it's important to note that the specific difference that you're bringing to the debate, and this is why the subtitle of your book, by the way, this is the book. It will be linked in the description of the video and on other platforms. The subtitle is The Case for First Amendment Pluralism. And I think that this is another aspect that you bring, which is important to underline, and it ties into this idea of what does it mean to be an association, what is the test, is this functional sort of autonomy, right, what they want, what they're trying to do, and also this protection of their inner rules, the inner traditions, right, the inner ways of functioning. What you're, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that what you're saying is that the idea is to let them be what they are, no matter what they are. And simply as a flourishing of human existence, not as a vehicle for speech, as a vehicle for political participation, a vehicle for anything, as a means to nothing, but as an end in itself. That associations are an end in itself, which by their very nature are necessary for human flourishing, and that's why they should be protected. Is that kind of the fundamental argument?
That's exactly right, yes. So the term pluralism that I use, it's in reference to this kind of failure of the court, a framework of the court of individual and state. So that's the only thing the court's going to think about when it addresses associations. And so First Amendment pluralism means no, you take individual and state, of course, those are there. Then you take this vast array of associations that are also there. And you have to have an analysis that recognizes them, that sees them in the case law and in our constitutional thought. To give them kind of full accord of the functional autonomy that they ought to have.
How ready do you think are the political and the legal elites, the class elites, not in a negative sense, but you know the common, the public arena, let's say in American society and politics, how ready do you think they are for such an understanding?
Yeah, so good question. So interestingly enough, I was contacted by some legislators, because they were interested in kind of bringing it up or incorporating it into what they were doing. Kind of unfortunately, so we get some interest there. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of other issues that are on their plate right now. So I think it's one of those things where in our highly polarized age, it's very difficult because it's going to, whichever side decides to take it up, it will immediately become anathema to the other side.
And that's why what needs to be avoided, and this is why I like that in the examples you give in the book, you show that this is not a partisan issue. This is not the case that started your interest. It might be a particular case about a particular group, but it's literally applicable to any group of any orientation of any kind, and you literally give a very wide range of positions that could be put under various, political umbrellas, and they all work. It all works because it is about the ability to be different, right? In fact, that's what it is. But you cannot be different if you cannot associate under that, under that umbrella, so to speak, right?
That's right. That's right. So it ought to be, the most bipartisan of all issues. This is all of our groups that we're worried about. So, one side is, it could easily just become an issue of one party just as soon as it comes up, polarization. The other issue is this might be a very good peacekeeping operation between the two sides. Well, we can agree that our respective associations are protected. I mean, we can agree on this. We're not going to agree on anything in the political sphere. We're going to fight, but this we can have, and this sphere we can agree on that. So I could see, it being a peacekeeping operation, and getting bipartisan support, possibly from some enough legislators that it'll get through. So I could see that happening, and that's the path I hope it takes.
Yeah, and I know that you've been involved with writing policy papers for various think tanks and so on, and maybe a path would be to start with state legislatures and maybe sort of the laboratories of democracy, as they are called. So the book is as everyone can hear and see, it's very fascinating. It's thoroughly documented. The argument is intricate, but it's actually simple to understand at the end of the day. The reception has been very positive. I'm sure you have received critiques as well, which is I hope you have taken them into account, and I know you talked about that in a different other areas about the criticisms, and I think that's good because there needs to be a dialogue. This is how such ideas are propagated. So I recommend anyone to pick it up and just to take a look at it, and then if you find it interesting for yourself to read it, of course. It really is a book with broad appeal because it does talk about things that concern us as human beings. It's not left, not right, and the argument goes deeper than just constitutional law, right? Which is, that's where it starts, but it has to do with much more. And now, a very natural segue into something else. One of your favorite books is On the Road, right? which I know that you used to read it once a year, if I remember correctly, from previous conversations. What would be your favorite books in terms of that you would share with your political science students? Would Wander on the Road be such a book to read in whatever context? And you know, when I say book that to read in a political science or political theory class, it's not a book necessarily about politics. I mean, we understand each other. So would On the Road be such a book? Do you think that On the Road has, because it is about a post-apocalyptic thing, does it have to do with some of the questions you talk about in this book, or would you use it in a political science class?
Yeah, so that's the book you're referring to, The Road by Cormac McCarthy, Pulitzer Prize winner in 2007, I think, and they made a movie out of it. Haven't seen the movie, I've been told it's good. And it takes place in this post-apocalyptic world. Something happens, you don't know what, and it wipes out all technology and all, basically, plant and animal life. So there's these kind of wandering bands of human beings trying to just dig up scraps and stay alive as long as they can. So it's this very bleak landscape. But in that landscape, there's a father and son who are traveling. You never learn their names. They're just the man and the boy. The man knows he's dying. You find this out pretty early in the book, so I'm not spoiling anything for you. And he's trying to just keep his son alive as long as he can. But it's this very human story of this fundamental human relationship between a father and son in a book that would vindicate Thomas Hobbes in his view of this is what it's like when you lose your government and your civilization. It's bleak. Everyone just kills everybody else.
And you don't live for long.
Yes. Roving bands of cannibals and these sorts of things, people just trying to survive. But then, maybe not. So these interesting themes of, well, here's love that still exists between a father and son. You still see, even kind of whiffs of civilization and relationships that come up later in the book. And so it's this very kind of fascinating study on, kind of human love and human relationships. It's been called a love letter to a son, is kind of how people have described it. He dedicates it to his own son. And so it's, Cormac McCarthy does. And so it's kind of this really interesting kind of study on this, kind of masterfully written, just an absolute masterpiece in terms of literature. Greats, I would say, in American literature. But it also touches on these kind of political themes of, Thomas Hobbes's, state of nature. Yes. And then, but then something beyond that, this human relationship that ends up being, beyond just all against all. It's not quite all against all. It's a father and son against all. Yes.
So it's almost like you're dropped in a Hobbesian state of nature / in a sort of a radicalized individualistic society where there's nothing but individuals, and yet it seems that the individual is more than that individualism, more than that dog eat dog or wolf against wolf. Another book that you've used in your courses, I noticed, I didn't know about this, is the Hunger Games. Why did you choose that book?
Yeah, so I taught this really fun short course on the Hunger Games. So that's interesting, kind of same thing. You have this society that's post-apocalyptic. Something happens, it wipes most human beings out. I point out there seemed to have been a revolution. Something like the French Revolution happened, but before the book starts. And I don't know if the author of the book even knows this, but you have this capital, just called the capital, and these districts just numbered. That's something the French revolutionaries tried to do, is just chop up the country into these districts that were purely administrative. And so something like that happened in the past. You don't learn, you just know that this is the society you're dropped into. So it brings up this kind of very interesting kind of political questions of this revolutionary society that produces a totalitarian state somehow. And there had been kind of attempts to overthrow it. But what comes after it when you overthrow it? That's an interesting thing. So we overthrow the oppressive government. Well, as it turns out, you might just end up with another oppressive government. That's a very real question in the third book. And so it brings up these really interesting questions. And what really is underneath of it? Of course, it's the fundamental human relationships. What gives Katniss Everdeen her strength? Well, part of it is her deceased father. So family plays a role. And as you find out in the prequel book, you probably is multi-generational of where she gets the songs that she sings and things like this. She got them from her dad, but her dad probably got it from his mother, I think is what we're supposed to draw from that, or aunts and uncles, something like that. And so there's this multi-generational kind of tradition of singing these songs that are opposed to the capital. And so there's that. There's the relationships that show up. There's the ways in which the capital uses its authority to kind of crush those under, turn people against each other. That's what the Hunger Games are all about, is keep people divided. You're going to hate the other districts because you will watch them kill your sons and daughters, which is the whole point of that, to remind you that you're subjugated and to hate each other. So that's an important kind of theme. This is how, it goes back to Aristotle again, this is how dictators keep their power, as they turn the people against each other and keep them suspicious, suppress their associations.
Yeah. So what was the response of the students to the book? I mean, because so from what I gather, you kind of read the books and you kind of teased out the political implications. Was that the purpose of the course?
The purpose of the course, exactly. Unfortunately, it was one of those courses developed kind of in response to COVID, because we couldn't be together, and so I could just do this kind of online course. It was entirely asynchronous, so I didn't get the student interaction that I would love from something like that. But from what I gathered, just in terms of enrollments, they seemed to like that, and liked the, they probably saw the movies and probably read the books, and then they got to kind of tease out the political aspects in these, and the social aspects and the human aspects that we're playing out in those books. Yeah. I think it's worth doing it in person, and I think students will enjoy it very much. And it's these are fun books, popular books. So just before we conclude, what is next for you? What do you have? Are you continuing this line of research, or are you looking at something else, or different aspects of this theme? What is next in the near or medium distant future? Yeah, so I'm thinking about ways in which our constitutional tradition actually recognizes these civil society groups in a broader sense. So I have an article forthcoming in an academic journal making the argument that when the term "the people" shows up in the Bill of Rights, it's a reference to civil society. So it shows up in the First Amendment, the Assembly Clause, as we talked about, is the right of the people peaceably to assemble. It shows up in the Second Amendment regarding the right to keep and bear arms, and the militias. Well, the militias were town institutions. So they were not state institutions, they were not federal institutions, they were town institutions, so civil society. It shows up in the Fourth Amendment, and it's a reference to the protection of the household, I argue, the right of the people to be secure in their person's houses, papers, and effects. Well, that's the household, and that even came up in the Anti-Federalist critique of the federal government. They said they're going to storm into our houses and terrorize our families. And so we get the Fourth Amendment in response to that, because that is what the English had done through the exercise of general warrants. So we get the Fourth Amendment that's very much a pushback against that. The federal government's not going to be able to do this. The context is the household, civil society again. So I'm kind of studying in that direction. How much can we protect civil society? What's our theoretical framework that'll help us protect civil society? What are the textual resources we have in the Constitution to do that, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I hope that, as I said, again, the conflict that comes to my mind again is the fact that is the public sphere in the United States, in the sense of the public arena, the politicians, the decision makers, are they, ready for this kind of a conversation? And again, from the perspective of the fact that we live in a liberal, even post-liberal paradigm, in which we have a shrunk, a reductive understanding of all these issues. You're proposing a much more humanistic, holistic, a much more generous understanding of the human nature, which is obviously the classical understanding, and it was the one of the framers, because they were educated in that understanding. My fear is that we have, the reductio ad absurdum has happened to such a degree that it's hard for people to even understand the argument sometimes that you would be making. So I hope again that you will find people who are ready to talk this. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Sheahan. This was phenomenal. I'm sorry we only have 1 hour to talk today. Maybe another time we'll continue this discussion. Nothing can be done alone, right? We just learned that, because we need other people. This whole project, this whole interview was facilitated by a large group of people, all of whom will be mentioned in the description box to the video and on the other platforms. Thank you again, Luke. This was fascinating, and good luck with these research projects, and good luck with bringing back this societal, social dimension into the public discourse.
Thank you very much.